Okay, so we have this is 43, game 2. We have a rowing team uses a boat with exactly 6 seats arranged in a single file and numbered sequentially 1 through 6. So just starting off, it's a pretty basic ordering game. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, we could go up and down if we wanted to. I just naturally go horizontal, but you can do it up and down if you want to. So we have 6 spots basically from the front to the back of the boat. Now, when it says like from the front to the back or from the back to the front, it's talking about it respectively. So it's saying we're sequentially 1 through 6, and it's from the front to the back. So that means the front of our boat is number 1, the back of our boat is number 6. When it's giving me directions like that, or when it uses words like next to, or front and back, side to side, northwest, east, south, stuff like that, I write that down above my graph so then I can notate that, because I already see it happening in the rules, but this can also happen in the questions. Is it's not talking about before or after, it's talking about the front, the back, closer, stuff like that. So to remind myself, I'm going to say the front is the first one, the back is the 6th one. So that way, when it says so-and-so is in front of so-and-so, I can know that it's going that way. If that makes sense. And we have our 6 athletes, which are L, M, O, S, V, and Z, each row in exactly one of the seats. So that's telling me that we're going to use all of them. And it's also telling me that because I have 6 variables and only 6 spots, none of them are going to repeat. We're not going to have any empty spaces. Everyone's going to fill in a spot. We're going to have a full diagram. So that's about as much as the setup goes. So we'll go into our next, or our rules, and then we'll go from there. So rule number 1 says M rows closer to the front than S. So this is where I was talking about that it talks about the front specifically. So if it means that R is closer to the front than B or S, that means that we have to have M to the left of S. M has to be as close to the front compared to S. So we can write that out as M, S. M will be closer to the front than S, who will be in the back. Now, when we think about worlds, we're thinking about where could we, or how can we eliminate that rule? And part of eliminating that rule is placing my variables down and not having to worry about thinking about where those variables go anymore. So looking at this rule itself, I'm not going to do much with it. And that's because when I think about where M can go, if I know that M always has to have at least someone behind it, that means that M can go from 1 to 5. And then going backwards, if I think about S, thinking that only one person at least has to be in front of it, means S could go from 6 to 2, or 2 to 6. So it's creating a lot of different places it can go, or our variables can go, because even if I put M in 1, S still has 2 through 6. If I put M in 2, S has 3 through 6, so on and so on. So it's creating a lot of different variation and possibilities for those variables. So I'm going to hang on to it for right now. And maybe there's another rule that I can combine it with to create like a Frankenstein rule or a bigger rule, and it becomes more restrictive. So I'm going to move on to my second rule. My second rule says S rows closer to the front than both L and V. So if we know that S is close to the front, that's kind of like our first rule, M is closer to the front than S. So S is always going to be on my left side of L and V. Now, when we write out L and V, it doesn't specify who goes first or if there's any form of order between L and V. It just says that S has to be closer than both L and V. So technically it could also be V and L. It could be L and V. They don't have to touch. They could be as far apart as possible. Technically, we could have S here, L here, and V here. S is still in front of L and V. So the way that I write this is I write it as S, and I anchor off S, and I do L, oh my gosh, I can't write today, and V. And I put them on top of one another to kind of remind myself that no one of those variables is worth more than the other. They're equal, basically. So there's no distinctive order between them. I just have to have it after S. So again, looking at our rule, I'm going to think about, okay, how can I eliminate that? And that creates a lot of different worlds still. Technically, when we look at S, where we could place S, it's now limited to, if I'm just looking at that one rule, 1 and 4, because two variables have to be at least after S. But it's still creating a wide variation, because even if I put S in 1, I have 5 spots that I could play around with L and V. But what I can do is I can combine these two rules and create like a monster rule. So what I could do, and the way that you're going to see this and find out if you can combine rules, is we have a common variable, S. And when we look at these kinds of statements or writing out the rules in the specific way, we can never go backwards. We always have to go forward. So when we look at these two statements and we look and see that S is a common factor, the way that I kind of want you to think about it is, I'm just going to overlap my S and create this bigger rule. Get my pen. If there was something that said L is before S, or L and V are before S, we can't flip it around to fit this. So we wouldn't be able to, like, I don't know, attach L and V here, or on the other one, we wouldn't be able to attach M there. We can never flip them to make them fit. What we have to do is we have to pick it up and basically think about how, like, we can't shift that order. So when we pick them up, we can only overlap them. So in this case, it would actually, if this was my rule, it would actually be something like this. M is before, or M, L, and V are all before S. So I'm always just overlapping my variable, which is why when we combine those two rules and we create this mega monster over here, it becomes a lot more restrictive. Because if we look at it now, M or S always has to have 1 before it and 2 after it, right? Regardless of what happens. So that means that the earliest S could go, if it has to have 1 before it, is 2. And the latest that it could go, if it has to have 2 after it, is 4. So now, instead of S being anywhere from 2 to 6 or from 1 to 4, it's actually restricted from 2, 3, and 4. We can also do this with M if we wanted to. If M has to have at least 3 behind it, if I'm just following my chain and I go whoop, whoop, if I'm following my chain, I'm hitting 3 variables basically. Get my pen again. Then that means that M only has 3 places it can go. Because if I have to go, okay, I grab a variable here. I'm thinking about where M can go. M can't go at 6 because it has to have 3 after it. So I can move it to 5, still not giving me 3 spaces. Move it to 4, still not giving me 3 spaces. Move it to 3. I now have 3 spaces where I could put S, L, and V in there. And if I keep moving M back and back, it's still giving me at least 3 spaces. So that's how we can figure out where these variables can go, is just slowly by moving our variable down or up the ladder and figuring out, do I have enough space for the other variables that are attached to it? So what we can do here is we can create worlds. I'm going to create worlds off of S just because it's in the middle. There's no specific way that, like, you have to do it. Actually, I'm going to do it by M. I just feel like M's maybe a little bit easier because I have this chain right here. It's in one direction. All my variables are in one direction, where S has it going in both directions. So I'm just going to focus on M and where I can place M. So we said it couldn't go in 6, 4, or 5. So M could go in 3. We said M could also go in 2, and N can go in 1. And I'm creating those 3 worlds because M can go in 3 different places. It doesn't have to go in one specific place. So I have to create the possibilities that M can go in. So now I'm going to move down my food chain, if you will, and place S, L, and V as much as I can. So in my first world, I actually have to place S, L, and V in certain places because I can't, basically, if I look at S has to have at least 2 after it, which means that it can't go in 6, can't go in 5, has to go in 4 because it can't go before M either. So it's only restricted to those 3 spots, and including the 2 variables that have to go after it means that it has to go in 4. Now I'm going to continue down my food chain, L and V. Like I said before, we don't really care about which order they go in because the rule is not specifying that. It's just saying that S has to go before both of them. They're kind of like independent of each other. So because L and V could go in 5 and 6 and they can kind of flip-flop with one another, I'm going to write it like this, L/V. So then when I go in and if a rule says if L is in 5, let's say I pick L here, that means I'm going to have to pick V here. So I can kind of remember that L and V are flip-flopping between those 2 spots. Now I'm going to go down to world number 2 and do the same thing. So if we've placed M, I'm going to move down my food chain a little bit more. And I'm going to see where I can place S. So S can't go in 6 because it has to have 2 after it. Can't go in 5. It can go in 4. And it can also go in 3. If I'm moving it backwards as I go down, it could also go in 3. So because that's creating another possibility that I could place S in, I'm going to create that 4th world. So then I don't have to worry about placing S anymore in that world. Now I'm going to focus on world 2 and then we'll focus on world 4. But in world 2, I'm going to focus on where I can place L and V. And it's kind of the same thing with our first world. L and V have to go after S. And because I only have 2 spots and I don't really care about the order of L or V, I'm going to flip them. Okay. Next one, the 4th world. I've placed my M, I've placed my S. I'm going to figure out where I could place L and V. So if L and V have to go after S, and I have 3 spaces after S, I'm just going to kind of write it out to the side or write it above here a little bit, kind of like this, to notate that L and V are going to have to go over there. It creates a lot of different possibilities where I could put L and V, especially because they flip-flop between one another. So, I mean, we could have L and V in 4 and 5, L and 4, V and 6, L and V in 5 and 6, and then flipping them too. So V and 4, L and 5, V and 4, L and 6, flipping them basically. So because that's creating a lot of different worlds, I'm just going to kind of write a little short note to myself to put that there because we still have a 3rd rule and that may fill in some spots in that 4th world. So I'm just going to leave it for now. And I'm going to go into my 3rd world now because we have to attack each world as if they're independent of each other. So M is in my first spot. So I have to think about where S can go because M has to come before S. So if 2 variables are after S, that means that if I'm moving backwards, or you could also move forward. If I'm moving backwards, I can't put S at 6, can't put S at 5. I could put S at 4. I could also put S at 3. And I could put S at 2. Because it's still giving me enough space to work with L and V. Now I'm going to go back into those worlds and place my L and V now. So my 3rd world, L and V are forced to go into 5 and 6, like my 1st and 2nd world. So L there, V there. In this world, in world 5, L and V, like my world 4, can pretty much go anywhere. So I'm just kind of notate it can go anywhere here. Because I also kind of want to notate to myself, like, it can't go in that second spot. It's banned from that spot, basically. And in my last world, world number 6, L and V pretty much become floaters at this point in that world, because any spot that I put L or V, it's never going to violate the rule that S has to come before it. So I can never accidentally put L or V before S. There's no spots that I could mistake that for. So I'm just going to kind of put L and V over here. I'm not going to do anything with it because nothing changes. If I put L here and V here, nothing changes with my diagram. And if I put L there and V there, nothing changes with my diagram. We're creating these separate worlds if things change in your diagram, and it kind of like creates this domino effect. So I'm just going to kind of write it out to the side. Not going to waste a whole lot of time with that. So now that I've got M, S, and my L and V semi-placed, I don't really have to think about this rule or these 2 rules anymore. So I'm going to erase it because I don't have to think about them anymore. But we're going to move on to our 3rd rule, which says that V and Z each row closer to the front than O. So if we have V and Z and they're closer to the front, that means that they're always going to be on the left side of O. Now I'm writing it that way because V and Z does not specify who has to go first. It just says that they have to be in front of O. So we could have Z before V, we could have V before Z. We don't really care. And they don't have to touch one another. We could split them out if we wanted to, but they could touch each other if they wanted to. So this is great because it's touching on my 2 variables that my other 2 rules didn't touch on, Z and O. So that'll kind of help us a little bit. So we're going to go into our first world and see if we can implement this rule, this 3rd rule. So I've kind of already placed V because it was mentioned in my other rule. So we have V here. No matter where I put V, I can't fit the rest of this rule. Because even if I said, well, I'm going to put V in 5, that means I have to put L in 6. No matter what, the Z and the O only have those 2 options. My number 1 and my number 2 is 2 options. And it's breaking the rule if I put either of those there because V is still after O. So rather than trying to force anything to happen, we're just going to eliminate it. And we can actually do that to world 2 and 3 because no matter where we put V, we don't have another spot for O to come after it, regardless of where we put Z. I don't have that spot after V to put O. So scribble out 2, scribble out 3. Now 4 is where we can kind of have some flexibility, right? So when we look at world number 4, I'm going to focus on V first because I've kind of got an idea of where V is going to kind of have to go. So I'm going to think about where I can put V in that 4th world. And because V has to have at least O after it, that restricts it to only 2 places. So if I'm moving my V backwards, can't put it on 6. I could put it on 5 because I could have O after it. And I could put it on 4 because I could have O after it. I'm going to do that. Okay. So I'm going to break it up again because depending on where I put V, it's going to determine where O goes. And we'll see what I mean in a second. So we have M, S. Let's say I put V at 4 here and V at 5 here. So looking at my 7th world, if I put V in my 5th spot, that's going to force O to come after it, which takes up my 6th spot. But if I look at my 4th world, when V is in 4, it doesn't force O to go into a certain spot like it did in my 7th world. O actually is going to flip with L over here. So no matter where I put L or O over here, it's always going to abide by the rule. Let me grab I got the hiccups. hopefully they go away. And looking back at my 7th world, I can automatically know where L goes because we said L and V had to be between these last 3. And if it's taking up 2 spots, that means L is going to have to go in my 4th spot. Ugh. Okay. And then let's just finish off the world because I only have 1 more variable and I only have 1 more spot. So I'm going to put Z in my final spot. And even when I put Z in that first spot, it's still following the rule of Z is before O. Okay. Whew. Ooh, not a good time to record. Okay. So we're going to do that to my 5th world now. Is we're going to figure out where V can go because we've got an idea of where V could go. And that's part of my 3rd rule that I'm trying to eliminate. So if I'm working my way backwards with V, V can't go in 6 because it has to have a spot for O. So that means that it can go in 5 or it can go in 4. So I'm going to put in 4 S here. Okay. Now I'm going to figure out where I can put O because that's my other variable. We know that V has to be before O. So if we look at world 5, that means that O can only go in 1 spot. In order for it to come after V, it has to be in my 6th spot. And in my 8th world, O can go in 5 or 6. And that's kind of like our 4th world where it's flipping with L because L is also going to have to come in between 5 and 6. And harping on L, if L had to be between 4, 5, and 6, that means we're going to put it in our last open spot there. And with our last variable, we're just going to fill it in because it is still before O. No matter where I put Z, it's going to follow this rule of Z has to be before O. So we've got 4 worlds so far. Now this is where it's going to get a little bit more difficult. Okay. Whew. So now we're going to look at our 6th world. And rather than figuring out where I could put V, I'm actually going to flip it to the other side and figure out where I could put O because we have a lot of space down here. It's kind of like we're starting off with a brand new game board. We don't have like anything interrupting our game board. We have just a blank slate down here. And no matter where I put L or V, it's going to follow my original rule that it has to come after S. So I'm going to work my way backwards on this 3rd rule because there's more variables that have to come before O than there are variables that have to come after V or that have to come after Z. So if I think of this chunk as I'm going to kind of figure out how early my O can go, it's going to help me. So if we know that 2 variables have to come before O, let's work our way backwards and figure out where O could go. So O could go in my 6th spot because I have 2 spaces at least to fill in V and Z before O. So we could have O in our 6th spot. Here's my board. I could have O in my 5th spot because I still have 2 spaces for V and Z. But I can't have O in my 4th spot because I'm losing a space for my V and Z before O. So those are the only 2 places that O can go is 6 and 5 in that world. So now that we've got that figured out, we can just kind of domino effect it. So in number 9, if we know that V and Z have to go before O, and there's only 2 spots before O, that means I can flip them because we don't care about what order, but they have to go in that spot. And filling in the rest of my world with L, that's gonna force L to go in my last spot. This is where the lines kind of become like an accordion. We can spread it out as far as we want or as close as we want. So here we actually have S, my V is gonna be somewhere here, and my L is over here. We're still following the rule that S has to be before V and L. Okay. Now down here, we have 3 more spots left, which means we still have 3 more variables, which are L, V, and Z. Now, anywhere I put those variables, I'm not going to violate the game in any way. Because even if I put V and Z somewhere in 3, 4, and 5, it's going to be before O. O is my last one. And vice versa with S. If S has to be before L and V, no matter where I put L and V in this spot, it's always going to come after S. So they're kind of like sandwiched in between one another, which is really great, kind of. It creates a lot of different possibilities because I could put L anywhere in here. I could put V anywhere in here. I can put Z anywhere in here. So what I do for this is I'm just going to kind of circle them and leave them be to know that anywhere I put L, V, and Z in that area, it's not going to violate my game. So rather than making, I don't know how many different worlds, I'm just going to say that's the pool that I can pick from and go from there. So those are my, oh my gosh, these hiccups. Those are my worlds. So, okay. Okay. Ooh. I'm going to leave it off for there right now. Let me know if this helps you out at all. And if you need help with the questions, then let me know. Okay. Where do I?